Hello, as usual, I'm Jamey from Stonemeyer Games, and today I'm joined by special guest Ray, who came up with a great idea for a video that I really like. Ray, why don't you introduce yourself and introduce this concept of what we're discussing today?
Hey, Jamie. My name is Ray Imgrund. I am a lifelong fan of board games and hobby gaming. And recently, I was trying to think about how how I'd get people into the hobby if they'd expressed an interest of, okay, so what are all these games you play? How can there be this much interest in a simple pastime? And that kind of started with figuring out how to introduce my wife to stuff because she didn't really grow up playing any sorts of games beyond kind of the basic Monopoly and stuff, which she generally hated. um, so so I thought, okay, what's a good way to kind of order these things to ease people into the experience of modern hobby gaming? And I asked Jamie what he thought about it.
Yeah, and I really like this concept because typically for these videos, they're kind of flat in that I have like a top 10 favorite worker placement games, and they're all worker placement games that I love. In this video, we're kind of talking about a progression of games. So if you're starting out trying to get someone into the hobby, or someone expresses interest in getting into the modern gaming hobby, how to start them out and how you can layer on new games to make them feel more comfortable with modern games, building up to our number ones, which at least for me is a medium weight game. So we're kind of building them towards a medium weight game, introducing different concepts and mechanisms along the way. So yeah, I think it's a great approach to introducing games to someone. I love this concept, and I'm excited to hear which games you picked for it, Ray.
All right.
Yeah, should we jump in? Why don't you tell me your so it's number 5, but it's really the first game, the game that you would start with. Yeah.
Yeah, so the first one that I had in mind. So unfortunately, I actually don't own most of the ones that are on most of the primary ones on my list because like I've played them with other people and then I think, great, these are awesome, and now I want to own other ones.
Yeah.
So the first one that I just got introduced to recently was Sushi Go, and I've been hearing about it for a long time. And after playing it just several times, I introduced it to my in-laws, who are also really not into games beyond like cribbage and stuff. They really enjoyed it and asked to play it a second time in a row, which is like the sign that it's something that actually works. So yeah, it's great because it's so simple, it's friendly, it's got the basics of card drafting, which is so important to so many later, even more deep games. Basic levels of hand management, and yeah, it's just a lovely introduction to the whole concept.
And one thing I like about it too is that well, it's adorable. That's part of it. But
Yeah.
it's on my list, I generally stay away from games with closed information. But in a drafting game,
Mm.
even though it's temporarily closed information, you're passing those hands around the table. And so they rapidly become essentially open information. And you could even play the first game completely open if someone isn't comfortable with closed
Hmm.
information. I say that because it's easier to guide someone through their turn as they're getting comfortable with the game if there's open information.
Yeah, that's a good point. That
Yeah.
isn't something I specifically thought of. So it'll be interesting to see how my list compares to yours in that regard.
That's true. Yeah, a couple of yours have some closed information, but again, in ways that could be
Hmm.
open for that teaching game, I think.
Hmm. So then, should I list my kind of honorable mentions
Yeah, so
now?
other games you might consider for that first step. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the two other ones I had was a game called Qwixx. It's actually from the same company, Game Right, that made Sushi Go.
Yeah.
It's a very easy to pick up roll and write, and a nice way to get introduced to that category of games. And you can play it with a pretty good number of people. It takes like 15 minutes.
Mhm.
For anybody who's not familiar with it, it's just rolling sets of dice, some of which are colored, and you're trying to fill in numbers from 2 to 12, either ascending or descending, and you're trying to get as many filled in, and that scales toward the number of points you get at the end of the game. Yeah.
Any other honorable mentions for this first step?
The other one was Draftosaurus, which is
Yeah.
a dinosaur drafting game. That
Yeah.
also is a nice short game, also open information, which is really fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a delightful little game.
And that's another set collection one, similar to Sushi Go. Yeah.
Yeah. Set collection. Each player has a little player board where you have a park that you're filling with dinosaurs of different colors and sizes. That one's really nice.
I love those picks. I took a slightly different approach with my number 5, but I think that'll work well for this list. I went with cooperative games for my first step in, because I thought cooperative games are really nice. They're low pressure for someone to play a modern game, but not feel like they are behind any other player because we're all on the same page in cooperative games. So I picked, this is a tough pick because I picked 3 cooperative games that I really love and can get up to the table with any person at any time. The number one that I picked was Mysterium Park, which is kind of a shorter version of Mysterium, where one player plays a ghost essentially that is communicating to the other players by giving them cards that represent dreams or visions or things like that, cards with this weird art. So they're trying to convey certain information, like where a murder didn't happen, and who didn't commit the murder, things like that. They're trying to narrow down a list of suspects and locations. But it's a really neat cooperative game that doesn't require any preparation in advance. There's no reading in it, so anyone of any reading skill level could jump in. A younger kid who can't read yet could jump in, and it doesn't take too long to play. So I think Mysterium Park is a really neat cooperative game. The other 2 that I thought of that were very close to this were Just One, which I think is a delightful social cooperative game, and The Mind, which is a numerical game where you're kind of just playing these numbers in order. Very simple cooperative games, just to kind of show someone that maybe their perception of games as overly competitive, and there are some overly competitive games on this list, but that not all games are that way, and that they're easy to teach because everyone's working together. Yeah,
Just One is one that I meant to have in my honorable mentions that I got at your recommendation, and everybody I played it with has totally loved it. So that was a top notch pick.
Nice. Great. I'm actually curious, before you go on to your number 4, there are no cooperative games on your list. Is there a cooperative game that you might use if for this category to introduce someone to modern gaming?
Yeah, one of my honorable mentions, I do have Mysterium later on. I've never played Mysterium Park, though. I've heard it's an even more approachable way to an already fairly approachable game. I think Mysterium base game just has a lot of overhead. Like the very first time that you're learning it, even if you're not playing the ghost, that I put it I decided to have an honorable mention and a little higher on my list.
Totally get that.
I also haven't played as many cooperative games, just because of the groups that I tend to be involved with. So
and I kind of move on from them after this number 1, but I kind of want to show people, hey, there's this whole category of games that if you really love this, we can go deeper into this, or we can go down this other route.
Yeah.
Great. What is your number 4 and any other games at the number 4 step for you? Or number 2 step?
Yeah. So the next place that I go after the delightful little introduction of Sushi Go would be say, okay, we'll go on to like an actual board game now and go with good old Ticket to Ride. I don't think it's possible to go wrong with this. I specifically said Ticket to Ride Europe because they have the stations that can make things a little easier on you. If you miss out on a particular route that you're going for, then you can place a station and just not get quite as many points at the end of the game and use somebody else's route. So then it's a little more friendly, and then it's just got the basic other Ticket to Ride good stuff with placing trains, and you're only doing one thing a turn, which makes it really, really easy to approach. You're only ever drawing or playing, and 2 different kinds of cards to draw, never at the same time. And it's like a super low level introduction to hand and resource management. And I think it's really nice for that. The other ones that I kind of had with there is like saying, okay, any version of Ticket to Ride is going to be great for this. I have heard, though I have not played because it's not publicly available, the new Ticket to Ride Legacy actually kind of does interesting things where it starts out super duper basic and then gradually ramps up. So that could even be like, I was thinking that could even be like something that you say, okay, we're going to play a couple games of Ticket to Ride and then play this, and maybe play those concurrently with the other games on this list and get more in depth that way.
Totally.
And then so there's that one, and then the other one that I had, I haven't played it a lot, so it might have made my list if I was more familiar with it, would be Seven Wonders Architects, which is a really stripped down and approachable way to play Seven Wonders, where there's still the drafting elements, but instead the main focus is just on building your wonder from the ground up, and the game ends when somebody finishes that. And then drafting options are really limited, where it's either one deck in the middle that's available to everybody, or a deck on either side of you that you share with the players to your left and right.
Right. Two things I really like about these picks, and one other pick that you'll mention in a minute, is that for Ticket to Ride, it is among modern hobby gamers, it's a very well-known game. So if someone knows how to play Ticket to Ride, they can probably go to any game night, any convention, any small event, and they then have a game that they know because someone probably has that game on their shelf. I think it's great to have a few games like that as we're introducing people these very widespread games, because then they can speak this common language of games. The other thing I really like is that in the games you mentioned so far, the games that I mentioned and that I will mention, a lot of them are very low stakes at the very beginning of the game. So like the first few decisions you make in the game, they're important, but they don't ruin your game if you make an uninformed decision. And so I think that's really helpful for all these games. And I think Ticket to Ride is a great instance of that. And you mentioned Ticket to Ride Legacy, how it kind of ramps up. That concept of starting with low stakes and building up to higher stakes, I think is great for any of these games if you're introducing a new gamer in a competitive game.
Yeah, so what you got?
Yeah, I have at number 4, I went with some games with a dose of luck, and mostly push your luck in these games, because I think a lot of people, at least Americans, know Monopoly as a game of rolling dice, but not really making many decisions based on those dice. And so I wanted some games where you have either dice or some element of randomness, where you have a lot of agency and control over the decisions you're making. The game that I picked is, and I have a lot in this category, but the game I picked is Incan Gold. So Incan Gold is a game where players are walking into a dungeon, which is represented by a row of cards. And every turn you are flipping a card. And right before you flip that card, players decide if they want to continue going into the dungeon or if they want to run out of the dungeon with all the loot that they've gathered so far. Completely open information game. It's very easy for one player to guide the experience through this game. And you play through 5 rounds. So if you make a dumb decision in round 1 or 2, or you get unlucky in round 1 or 2, you still have a chance to compete in the game. And it's one of these games that's just kind of a good time with a lot of people. People are kind of cheering, people are rooting for each other or rooting against each other. It's that kind of push your luck in the game. So Incan Gold was my number 1 pick. I also put Can't Stop, Spots is probably the newest one on this list, No Thanks, and Deep Sea Adventure, all of which involve, or almost all of which involve dice rolling. No Thanks doesn't, but most of them do. And they all involve like a slight element of chance that I think people will be familiar with if they've played Monopoly, or maybe even if they're also poker players and they like that element of chance of what cards are going to come up in the next moment. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah. The only one of those that I have played is Incan Gold. And yeah, I really enjoyed my experience with that. And yeah, it's so approachable. It's just, all right. Yeah. The mechanic is just pushing your luck. It's not anything inherently complex in the game itself, and everybody can get that. Even little kids don't usually have a problem with that sort of thing. So yeah, those other ones all sound interesting, but I just haven't played it.
Yeah, they're great games. They're all approachable games. I think that's a good word for this stage, this step. Let's get to the middle step. What is your kind of your middle stepping stone here into modern hobby games?
The granddaddy of them all. I think this is a perfect time to bring in Catan. And I think everybody at this point, unless you're living under a seriously large rock, has at least heard of Catan, using the variable board and resource production based on dice. So this is probably the main game that I have where there's a significant element of luck in it. And it's got hand and resource management, it's got strategy building, and even what I'd call like an early form of engine building based on on how you lay out your settlements and your roads and where you decide to put your first cities, or if you're going to really go for developments and what you're planning on building in the future. So, and then there's also the fun that the board changes a little bit every game. Like it's not going to be night and day, but it keeps that sense of fun variability there, so that the games take a very, very long time to get stale. And then at that point, you can buy expansions and they get exciting again.
Right. There's also a lot of trading that happens in the game too. There's a lot of talking between players in a game of Catan.
Yeah, which helps it turn into can be a grand social event if you got people really into that.
Yeah.
One of my favorite memories was playing a number of years ago with some of my friends, and one of them really didn't want to make a trade, and the other one really did, and then finally said, "Okay, I'll give you the thing you want, and then give me this." And it was like asking for a sheep, and then he actually was just giving a sheep, so no real exchange occurred. So that's nice. One of my favorite trading memories associated with Catan, an actual non-trade.
I like it.
So I had one honorable mention that I haven't heard a lot of people talk about for this game is and it's one I do own. It's called Ceylon. So it is a it's based on history. So the island of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, used to be really well known for its coffee production, and then there was a blight in like the 1500s, and then some forward-thinking entrepreneurs said, "Hey, this is a great place to grow tea. Let's do that." So now they grow some of the best tea in the world there. And so it's based on that period of history. So it's a particular historical setting on this really pretty board and pretty components. And basically the main mechanic of the game is you harvest tea and then you fulfill contracts. And then the more players that you've completed contracts with, you sell to outsiders. Everybody playing the game is just growers effectively. You do contracts with outside companies. Then the larger number of companies you work with, the more points you get. And the action mechanic system, I think, is something I really like, because it has an effect of everybody takes a turn on everybody's turn. Where everybody has a hand of cards, and you play. I'll pull out one of the cards so that you can see. Every card has two actions on it. So let's see if you can see this well. So there's the top and there's the bottom. So the player, the active player, plays the card a certain way face up, and then say take this action, which I believe is harvest. Then all other players in order can either take the lower action, which I think is hire somebody, or one of the two mini actions in the middle, which is either move your main worker or collect some money. So everybody gets to go on everybody's turn, and you can play it kind of cutthroat, where I might think where I think, okay, I know that my opponents can make use of this action, so I'll make sure they don't have access to it. Or when you're first introducing people, then you can just say, oh, I'll just not care about that aspect. I'll just do whatever's beneficial to me, and then if anybody else benefits, then they benefit, and it's fine.
Yeah.
So I really like that one. It's more relaxed than Catan, and especially if somebody needs a little more guidance, then it can be like, okay, so I just played this card, so you could do this now, and then on your turn, if you have a card that lets you sell your tea, then if you're able to harvest now, you can sell later, and you'll be good to go. So.
Cool.
So it's a little bit longer, but yeah, it's a little bit longer of a tangent there, but yeah, I've heard almost nobody talk about it, so but it's a really good game.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
Yeah. So that was my only other one to kind of tier with Catan, because they're both resource production, hand management, and one's a little less luck based, a little more strategy. One's a little more cutthroat, one's a little less so. So
cool. And number 3, so I delved into this idea of a common language of games. So teaching people this a certain element of games that they can apply to a lot of different games, and that is polyominoes. I think most people are familiar with Tetris, and Tetris has made its way into a number of modern games. And so I picked a few games in this category that I thought there's the idea that someone already is familiar with Tetris, familiar with this concept, but probably needs to know a little bit more to see how it fits into modern games. And so I went with Patchwork. And the other reason I chose Patchwork is that it's just one other player. So a lot of the games on this list that I picked, except for actually my next one, are typically played with more than 2 players. But sometimes it's nice and more low pressure just to play a game with one other person. It also shows them that in the gaming world, there are a lot of games designed specifically for 2 players and not necessarily for larger groups. Shows them that there's a whole category of games like that. So I think Patchwork, it's very easy to play. You're putting together a quilt. It's a very pleasant theme using these polyomino tokens. What you're doing on your turn is very simple as well, in terms of just, you're gaining a tile, you're placing it on your quilt. And so I thought it was a good introduction to polyomino games. The other 2 that were very close to it for me were Blokus. I love Blokus, and Cartographers. Play a little bit on the heavier end for a polyomino game, but both very easy to teach and play. And it gets someone into this concept of kind of spatial polyominoes in modern hobby games.
Yeah, I wasn't even necessarily thinking of, okay, thinking about like categories of, oh, here's a category, let's bring that in. Here's a category, let's bring that in. I wasn't necessarily thinking that, but that's a really nice way to approach things, because I wasn't really familiar with like the category of polyominoes. I had played Blokus a long time ago, and then suddenly in this last year I've picked up Patchwork and Cartographers, and suddenly I'm now a fan of these types of games. So I like the way that you're approaching this with also like categories in mind.
Yeah, just trying to this idea of introduce people to the language of games, so that when they hear a concept, like I don't have a worker placement category in here, but that would be probably pretty helpful for them to learn what a worker placement game is, and be able to jump into that. I do have one. My next category is very specific and very widespread. But what is your number 2? What approach did you take for that?
So my number 2 is, maybe I spoke too soon. It's the only place where I was thinking, oh, here's like a kind of a category, tile laying, where I said, okay, good old tile laying. So I figured Castle of Mad King Ludwig is a really nice way to go for this, where it had every player is building your own castle, so you're only competing with other players over the particular pieces themselves. You don't have to worry about anybody coming in and ruining the castle that you have built. Can never be taken away from you. So that's really nice. And then it's a really pleasant game to look at and to play. So that can be really helpful. And it gets you into tile laying, and as well as teaching you how to adapt your strategy as the game goes on based on the different goals that you get and the goals that are public. Because I really like the public and private goals, because then there's stuff that everybody's fighting over, and then there's one thing that only you're fighting over, which can introduce some really fun strategic elements to it. Yeah. And also generally you're only doing 1 to 2 things per turn, so it's never too outlandish. And it also has a self-regulating economy, which is a really fun thing to have. So then the other one was one of the other classics of tiling, Carcassonne. So then instead of everybody having their own thing, everybody builds a map together, which can be a really exciting multiplayer experience, to be like, to at the end of the game look and say, wow, we've got this whole county in France laid out on our table. This is and we built it ourselves. So the way that works with how you can build castles and farms, and then you can kind of compete with each other over them, try to jump in on somebody else's claim, makes for a more cutthroat game, which can be really nice if that's what your table is in for. And also it depends on if people want a more kind of individualistic experience, or if they're okay with like a broader, slightly more abstract experience. So those 2 games really are kind of a toss-up for me. Either one could be good, just depending on what people like.
What I really like for castles too, and this works for Patchwork, showing people that there are many games where you have control over something that no one can disrupt. I think that can be very reassuring and pleasant to people if they're getting into games. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. So what you got for your second place?
So at number 2, or my getting up to the last step here, the language I wanted to teach people here is deck building, because I think deck building is a concept we see in a lot of games. It can open you up to just so many games if you know how the core system of deck building works in many games. And I decided to go with a recent favorite, partially because of the theme, the Star Wars deck building game. Again, it's a 2-player only game. Well, you can play with more players. It's primarily designed for 2 players, but it uses a lot of classic deck building concepts while also adding this idea that the player interactions you're not directly hurting your opponent except for their base. Rather, the cards, once you get cards into your deck, your opponent can't take away those cards. And so it gives you this control that you were talking about with castles, where you have this thing that you have control over that the opponent can't hurt. But when the cards are in the middle row, that's when you can interact with it. But the combination of the Star Wars IP, which, everyone in the world is familiar with, combined with this idea of being able to teach the language of deck building to someone, I thought this would be a good introduction. My number 2 game was the Quacks of Quedlinburg, which I didn't pick for this. I think it's a good pick because it's a very easy game to guide people through. It has that element of chance. There isn't a lot of text in the game, but it is more of an offshoot of deck building. I feel like if you want someone to understand the language of deck building, you start with the 5-card format. Draw 5 cards, do something with those cards, discard the rest, and do it again.
I struggled to think of a way to put deck building on my list, because I don't think I've played a good like Star Wars maybe is. I don't think I've played a good entry level deck builder, because I think Dune Imperium is my favorite game, but it's a little beyond the scope of this list. And I've never played Clank, though I'd like to. And the only other deck builders I played are Dominion, which I think is maybe a little outdated at this point for an entry level game, and a really bad Lord of the Rings knockoff deck builder that lets you destroy other people's cards, and it's terrible. So yeah, nobody ever get that.
I did think about Dominion because that was, I feel like maybe 5 or 10 years ago, that was a game that everyone was playing, or it seemed like everyone was playing it, and so that would have been pretty important then. I feel like fewer people are playing it now. They're playing other deck building games. So yeah, everyone's Star Wars. What about your number 1? What have you built up to? What, after all this that people have learned through the first 4 steps, what does it culminate in for you?
So for me, it culminates in, it's not, I wouldn't quite call it a midweight game, but it's a game that incorporates hand management, resource management, drafting, and little bit of the engine building theme of building up and tableau building of building up the right set of cards and everything, is Seven Wonders. And this is a delightful game of all these different themes that, in the end, once you have it set up, it's like a half-hour game. And when you're teaching people, it's not that big a deal for me to lean over and say, oh, okay, so here's your hand. What you should be thinking in the first stage is you want to be picking up more resources, so that in the second age you can be thinking about, okay, how am I going to build on this? Am I going to start working on my wonder, which is also one of my favorite things, where it introduces asymmetry into the equation, where the wonder isn't essential to the way you play, but it can really guide your strategy. And and then once you do have it set up and you've played around, once you finish, you can say, hey, everybody want to play again? And you can play 2 more games within the space of like an hour. And I love that ability to just cycle through a game if everybody wants to. And then it can change so much that your strategy will never, ever be able to be the same, because it can be affected so deeply by the actions of the other players. So that's my number 1.
I think you're totally right. I like the length consideration, that you can play multiple times in the same sitting. I think that repetition really helps someone understand a game when you're able to do that. And even in Seven Wonders, I don't think I've ever done this, but you could play the first round, play the first era, and then people get it at that point, and then be like, okay, well, let's just, now that you get it, let's do this for real and replay that era, and it would be just as engaging to do it again. This is a great pick.
That's something I hadn't thought of before, but that could be a really good way to introduce it in the future.
Yeah. Do you have any other games at this level that you thought of?
Yeah, the other one that I had at this level was my sole cooperative experience. This is where I put Mysterium. Because at this point also then, even though there's a little bit of overhead when you're first introducing it, everybody working cooperatively can really help make sense of it. And you can say, hey, have you ever played Clue? It's like a really fun version of Clue that doesn't get stale after you've played it more than a few times. Yeah. And yeah, it's such an interesting experience. It's hard to get tired of Mysterium, especially if, I mean, they just have expansions that are more dream cards. So then even if you're getting a little tired of the stuff in the base game, then you can toss in even more and it gets more interesting. So, and then the other one I thought about like maybe putting in something like, the only other like truly midweight game that I might have put in here might have been Wingspan, because it's another one that has that at this time has so much publicity, is so well known. A lot of people will say, oh yeah, I've heard of that, it looks nice, even if they know nothing about games. If you're just interested in birds, if you like pretty illustrations, then if I'm with a group that is really willing to say, okay, what's the next thing, then I might say, okay, let's bring in Wingspan to play around with some birds for a while. And another thing where you can't destroy what other people are doing. There's a lot of positive player interaction. The only negative thing is when somebody takes the bird that you really, really want, but can't blame it for that. So that was the heaviest game on my list as an honorable mention, because it's just so good.
That's a great segue into my number one pick, because I actually did go with Wingspan for it. For some of the reasons that we've talked about today. I know I don't often pick Stonemaier games for this list, but I actually think it's pretty good to build to a game like Wingspan. It's medium weight. There's a lot of replayability in the game due to the cards. And like you said, it's pretty widespreadly known at this point. And so people have either heard of it, many people have either heard of it, or they probably should hear about it, because again, it's one of those games that's on so many shelves that if they go to someone's house, they can speak this common language of Wingspan now if they know how to play. The other reason I picked it is I think Wingspan's action system, I love streamlined action systems where, there's just a few things that you need to know to start taking turns in Wingspan. You need to know how these basic actions work, either lay eggs, draw some cards, or gain some food. Not that complex, or you play a bird. So I think even that, I think like my next, if we had even another level, I might have gone up to, well, we would need a couple more levels, but I might have built up to a game like Arc Nova that has a very streamlined action system, very complex beyond that. But I really like these games where the action system is very simple, but it leads to a lot of complexity in terms of the birds that you choose, the engine that you build in the game. So yeah, I picked Wingspan for it. My runners up for this were, I mentioned worker placement. That's one like common language that I think is helpful for someone to know. I picked Lords of Waterdeep because I think that's probably one of the simpler worker placement games that you could play. And then I picked Space Base as my other pick here. Space Base is another game similar to some that you mentioned, where everyone is doing something on every turn. You're engaged in every turn, and it's kind of the level up to Catan, I think, Space Base. And that one player is rolling 2 dice, and all players are generally activating something based on what the results of those dice. And it's both these games, all these games are pretty easy to guide players through their turns if they're trying to catch on to how the game works. So yeah, Wingspan, and then Lords of Waterdeep and Space Base as alternatives.
Yeah, those are. Unfortunately, of those three, I've only played Wingspan. I've been wanting to play Lords of Waterdeep for a while, but nobody I know owns a copy, so that's a little limiting. So I think one of my friends might be getting that soon. So hopefully I can experience that for myself. And I've heard about Space Base, but yeah, never played it either. So those are excellent choices. And yeah, again, you're thinking along the lines of, okay, what's another category? Worker placement. It's which is, I know it's one of your favorites. It's incorporated in all of your games, and I started enjoying playing worker placement before I even knew what it was. And then I discovered later on, after like 5 or 6 games in, oh, this is what these are called. These are delightful.
Well, I think that's one of the nice things with both of our lists. After someone would play through my 5 games or your 5 games or a mix of them, then probably have some sort of an idea of the types of games they want to continue to play. They might want to continue to play worker placement games. They might want to play more drafting games. And then there's whole other offshoots. We could do a top 10 for each of these categories for someone to say, I like this one thing that you introduced me to. Show me more games like that. I want to discover them. Or just spend a while going deep into one game. That's what I did when I got into the hobby as an adult. I played a lot of Catan for a while, and then we got into Agricola, and we played. That's all we played for years. We just played that. So I think that's a good thing for me to remember when I'm introducing someone to the hobby, that they might just want to play that same game a lot, and that's okay. That's okay for them to do that.
Yeah, I think that was one of my biggest challenges personally when trying to introduce people is saying, okay, I know I really like these games, but they might not really like them. So I nearly totally sabotaged my wife's interest in modern board games a long time ago because I was so excited about Scythe. It was a very, very poor mistake, and I've learned a lot since then, because it's like, okay, she might like this game one day, but it's way too much. It's way too much. It's such a good game, but it's way too much. There's been some growing pains on my end, which is part of why I was thinking so much about this. Like, okay, how can I make sure that I won't destroy the chances of somebody to actually at least appreciate, if not get into the hobby?
Right. Well, and I think that's a great thing to keep in mind. We've created these lists here, which we think in general could be a good way to introduce someone into the hobby. But in the end, it's us putting ourselves in someone else's shoes and figuring out what might excite them, what might engage them, whether it's a theme that they're interested in or a theme they're definitely not interested in, or whatever type of mechanism. If I started out with cooperative games and I noticed that that person really, really liked that idea of cooperation, I might scratch the rest of this list and go just kind of level up on cooperative games. So really paying attention to them, what they're interested in, what they're enjoying, I think is really important when you're trying to help someone get into the hobby.
Yeah, I certainly agree.
Ray, this has been awesome. I love this list. I love things that welcome people into the hobby, help people get deeper into the hobby. So thank you so much for coming up with this idea and spending your time coming up with the list and talking about it. I really appreciate that. And I'd love to hear from anyone watching this as well. If you have a 5-point list here, a 5-step list to get someone into the hobby, or anything that you think about as you're trying to introduce someone into modern hobby games, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Jamey. This was a lot of fun, and I look forward to seeing what other people might comment, because I'm always looking for ways to bring other people in.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, I'm curious to see what people say.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ray. Take care.
Yeah, you too.